First Nations,
Indigenous,
Aboriginal,
Indian,
Métis.
The first time I heard of the First Nation people being labeled as Indigenous was not too long ago. I had no idea that it was changed to Indigenous until I had spoken to someone. I can't remember who exactly, but and she said, "We're not called First Peoples anymore. They changed it to Indigenous." And I thought, oh, really? Well, I guess I didn't know what to think at first because I'm so used to First Nations, right? In the beginning, it was Indians. And then with that, lots of changes. I didn't really like being called Indians, because of our past history of what people in the social media or the people in whole, that they labeled us that, and along with that it was like savages and how we lived and stuff like that. So I got to dislike the term Indians. And
on myself, I'm okay with the new labels that have been coming up for the First Nations because it seems like a lot of respect. I'm also happy right now with the both governments getting along and working with the First Nation because we never had that years ago. It's just a huge change now in the last couple of years, so I'm very happy with that. Do you have anything to add, Billy?
Yeah, I think it's, Kevin pretty well covered most of it, but, I look at it as the First Nation people are really getting educated, and there's a lot of our First Nation people are getting educated, and it's changing the label towards how non-First Nations people look at First Nations people. So that's what I look at as that, because we got some people who are becoming, lawyers from our close surrounding reserves, right? And I look at that, and some are working in hospitals, they're working in, in X-ray and stuff like that, right? So that, to me, that means a lot to First Nations people.
I think the labels that are being used for First Nations, Indigenous peoples here in Canada really reflects the growing social understanding and awareness that is developing especially in the younger generations, that the older generations didn't have the understanding of, and that reflected misconceptions, misunderstandings in the traditional sense. So you have up until even technically today, the word Indian being used to refer to Indigenous people across Canada, and still being used in government documents today. I have an Indian status card, literally says the word Indian on it.
I think that it's a really interesting question because it has evolved, but fundamentally government legislation remains the Indian Act. So if you were looking at just purely how people make that reference point, you'd have to say that until the government changes how they address First Nations communities, that until the Indian Act is no longer the Indian Act, it's still going to be in the repertoire of Canadians' reference points. I think the really interesting thing is that we see new legislation, like the bill that was tabled just before the House broke in the summer on repatriation of Indigenous artifacts, and in that case, the government is using the term Aboriginal. It's the Aboriginal Repatriation and Cultural Repatriation Act. And so there is this evolution even from bureaucracy, that there's a change in how government looks at those labels, but it's still outdated. So you see, it went from the reference point was Indian, Aboriginal, First Nations, which has now made way for Indigenous, a much broader category.